It started on a morning so still, I could hear the lake breathe. The water was glass, still enough to reflect the oak trees and the pale blue sky that hung above my small piece of heaven. That lake wasn't just part of my property. It was part of my peace. I built my dock with my own hands, set every board, painted every plank. When the sun hit the surface, it felt like time slowed down. Just me, my dog, and the sound of rippling water that I bought this land 7 years ago, far from the noise of the city. To find some quiet. The lake had always been mine, or so I thought. The property line ran straight through it. A clean line marked in the county records and on every survey I ever paid for. But to the HOA across the road, that line was more of a suggestion. At first, they didn't bother me. My house sat just outside their neighborhood, close enough to see their manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, but far enough that I wasn't part of their rules. I liked it that way. No board meetings, no approved paint colors, no one telling what kind of boat I could dock. Freedom had a view, and I owned it. But freedom, I learned, makes some people nervous, especially people who like control. The first letter came on a Tuesday. A plain white envelope with the HOA logo stamped in the corner. Inside, a typed notice: unauthorized use of a shared lake and violation of community standards. They fined me $500 for disturbing the natural aesthetics of the common area. I remember laughing out loud when I read it. I wasn't even part of their HOA. How could they fine me? I tossed the paper into the trash and went back to my coffee. But that was the day my peace began to unravel. 3 days later, a man in a gray polo showed up at my gate. Clipboard, sunglasses, the kind of confidence that comes from being wrong too often. He introduced himself as Rick, head of the HOA Compliance Committee. He said the lake was a shared community resource, and I needed to remove my dock immediately. That I told him politely that he was mistaken. The lake wasn't theirs. It was on my land. He smiled, the kind of smile that hides a threat, and said, "That's not what our records show." That night, I sat at my desk and pulled out my property deed, tracing the boundary line with me finger like it was a scar. I checked the county GIS system online. Clear as day. The lake and the land beneath it were mine. I even called the county assessor's office to confirm. The clerk chuckled. "They've tried that before," she said. "You're in the clear." Still, something about Rick's smirk stuck in my head. It wasn't just arrogance, it was certainty. Like he knew something I didn't. The next week, I came home to find orange flags stuck in the dirt near my shoreline. Survey markers. Rick called them when I confronted him. He said the HOA had new evidence, proving that part of the lake was within their community's common maintenance area. I asked for the documents. He refused. That night, I sat by the window and watched the reflection of the HOA streetlights shimmer in the water. My dock, half lit by the moon, looked like a bridge to nowhere. Something told me this wasn't about property lines. That it was about control. And control, I've learned, is the real currency of suburbia. They wanted mine. A week later, I woke to the sound of engines outside my window. 2 pickup trucks idled by the road. Men in neon vests unloading equipment. One carried atropod, another carried measuring poles. A small drone hummed above the trees, its red light blinking through the morning fog. That I walked out onto the porch, coffee in hand. "Can I help you?" I called. Rick stepped out from behind one of the trucks, clipboard in hand like always. "Just confirming boundaries," he said with that same practiced calm. "Whose boundaries?" I asked. He smiled. "Ours." That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a campaign. By noon, they'd hammered stakes into the dirt just a few feet from my dock, marking what they claimed was community property. The flags flapped in the wind like little warnings. My dog growled every time he saw them. That evening, I got another letter, this time certified mail. Failure to remove unauthorized structures may result in legal action. It said they had attached a photo of my dock, circled in red ink like evidence in a crime scene. That I didn't sleep much that night. I sat at my kitchen table, lit only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the reflection of moonlight on the lake. I wasn't angry yet. I was confused. Why were they doing this? Why come after me when the county records were crystal clear? The next morning, I decided to fight back the right way. With paper that I drove down to the county courthouse, requested every plat map, title record, and legal description from the day my property was first registered. I even found an old hand-drawn survey from the 1960s, faded but legible, showing that the entire shoreline, including the lake bed, was private land. Mine. The clerk helped me certify the documents and even notarized copies for legal defense. You'd be surprised how often HOAs overreach, she said. They see an open space and assume it's theirs. I smiled and thanked her, not realizing how right she was. When I returned home, I found a bright orange notice taped to my front gate. Notice of violation. Daily fines accruing. $100 per day. It didn't make sense. They had no jurisdiction, no authority over me. But that didn't stop them. Every day, they sent new notices, noise complaints, unauthorized use of community amenities. Even a claim that my fishing boat was an eyesore visible from HOA property. I started documenting everything. Photos, dates, times, phone calls. I logged every envelope and even the tire tracks where their trucks had parked. Then one evening, I caught something that made my stomach twist, that I was walking back from the dock when I saw two men from the HOA standing on my side of the property line, cameras in hand. Photographing my backyard, I shouted for them to leave. One of them laughed and said, "Public access, buddy. You can't stop us." Public access. On private land. That was the moment I knew I needed more than paperwork, that I called a property attorney, a calm, older man named Harris, who had seen plenty of HOA disputes in his day. He listened quietly as I explained everything. When I finished, he leaned back and said, "They can't fine you. They can't touch your property, but they can make your life miserable if you let them. So don't." He offered a simple piece of advice. Document, stay calm, and let them dig their own hole. And dig they did. That a few weeks later, the HOA president, a woman named Linda Pierce, called me directly. Her tone was polite but cold. She said they intended to formalize control of the shared lake area, and that non-compliant property owners would be subject to penalties. I asked her to clarify who the property owners were. She said, "Anyone who borders the lake." I laughed. "Then I guess I'm the only one." There was a pause, then a quiet reply. "Not for long." That night, I couldn't shake those words. Not for long. IT wasn't just a threat, it was a plan, and I was about to find out just how far an HOA would go to steal what it couldn't control. The first sign that something bigger was coming appeared one quiet Thursday morning that I walked out to my mailbox and found a thick envelope with the county seal. Inside were papers labeled petition for easement adjustment. At first glance, it looked official, dense legal text, survey diagrams, and a map showing my lake with a red shaded zone labeled proposed community access. The petition listed the HOA as the applicant, and in fine print, I saw something that made my pulse skip. They'd cited my name as a neighboring stakeholder. That meant they were trying to redraw the boundary lines, essentially asking the county to declare part of my property as theirs. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was theft by paperwork. That I called my attorney, Harris, and read him the first few lines. He sighed. "That's a classic move. They file something vague, count on you not responding, and if you miss the hearing, they win by default." So I marked my calendar. I wasn't going to miss it, but the HOA wasn't finished. A few days later, someone posted online about community access to the lake opening soon. Pictures of the shoreline, my shoreline, were shared on their Facebook group, full of comments like, "Finally, we can enjoy what's ours." I scrolled through the posts, each one more infuriating than the last, and then I saw Rick's comment, "We'll handle the paperwork. The board is confident." Confident in what? In stealing my land. That weekend, Things turned ugly that I woke to find construction tape stretched across the far edge of my property, just beyond the oak trees. Wooden stakes had been driven into the soil, spray-painted arrows marking a future walkway. That I followed the line of tape and found 3 HOA volunteers unloading gravel and wooden planks from a trailer. "What do you think you're doing?" I called out. One man looked up and said, "Building the community path." I laughed bitterly. "You're trespassing." He shrugged. "Rick said it was fine." That's when I pulled out my phone and started recording. I captured their faces, their vehicles, the tape, the tools, everything. Rick arrived 20 minutes later, storming up in his golf cart like he owned the place. He looked furious when he saw me filming. "Turn that off," he snapped. "Not a chance," I said. "You're trespassing on private land." He smirked. Not for long. It was the same line Linda had used. The same quiet arrogance. When they finally left, I walked along the disturbed soil. My peaceful lakeside had become a construction site of defiance. That night, as I uploaded the footage to my cloud drive, Harris called. "Keep everything," he said. "Don't confront them again. They're baiting you, hoping you'll lash out, so they can't claim harassment." He was right. 2 days later, I received a letter accusing me of verbal aggression and recording community volunteers without consent. The HOA had filed a complaint with the sheriff's office. That I showed the deputy my deed and the video evidence. He shook his head. "You're not in Terre HOA," he said. "They have no jurisdiction, but they can sure waste your time." That's exactly what they did. Phone calls, letters, notices. They flooded me with noise. Every week brought a new claim, a new false fine, a new rumor. Neighbors from across the road began to stare when I drove by. I became the villain in their story, the outsider blocking access to something they'd never owned. And then came the day of the county hearing. That I arrived early, suit pressed, documents in hand. The HOA board sat together at the long wooden table, led by Linda, calm and confident. Their lawyer, young, polished, expensive, laid out their case. The community had historically maintained the lake area, they said. They even presented photos of residents kayaking and picnicking by the water. When my turn came, I placed the original property deed on the desk and said, "This lake has never been common property. It was sold to me with full rights, and I've paid taxes on every square foot since the day I moved in." The clerk examined the maps, flipping between their survey and mine. Finally, she looked at Linda. "Your map is outdated by 16 years, she said flatly. "This petition is denied." The silence that followed was worth every sleepless night. Rick looked like he'd swallowed glass. Linda's jaw tightened, her face pale. I almost felt sorry for them, almost. When I left the courthouse, I thought it was over. But the thing about people who crave control, they don't stop when they lose. They just find a new angle. For a few weeks after the hearing, things went quiet. No letters, no warnings, no orange flags in the dirt. The lake returned to its old rhythm, soft ripples, morning fog, the sound of geese landing in the shallows. For the first time in months, I could breathe, but silence, I've learned, is just the sound of someone planning their next move. One afternoon, I was walking the edge of my property when I noticed something strange. A small sign half hidden by grass. White letters on green metal. Community property. No trespassing without HOA permission. They put up a fake sign on my land. That was when something inside me clicked. I wasn't going to wait for their next move. I was going to make mine. Harris and I met the next morning at his office. The place smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, comforting in a way that only the smell of legal order can be. He listened quietly as I told him what I'd found. "Then it's time we stop reacting," he said. "Let's go on offense." He explained something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. While researching me deed, he discovered an old easement clause buried deep in the county records. Decades ago, when the subdivision across the road was built, the developer had accidentally encroached on a thin strip of land that actually belonged to my property's parcel. It ran right under their HOA's entrance sign, and part of their community garden. In other words, the HOA had built on my land without even knowing that IT wasn't much. Less than half an acre, but it was enough. Enough to matter. Enough to remind them who they were dealing with. So, together, Harris and I drew up a plan. First, I filed a notice of ownership clarification with the county. Completely legal, just reaffirming that the HOA's entrance and landscaping sat partially on my parcel. Once it was recorded, I had full authority to decide access terms. Then, a week later, I had a small wooden sign installed right beside their big stone HOA monument. It read simply, "Private property. Used by permission only." Within hours, my phone buzzed nonstop. Rick called first. "You think this is funny?" I said, "Not funny. Educational." He threatened legal action. I told him I'd be happy to meet in court again, but that was just the beginning. 2 days later, I leased a tiny strip of land, the one beneath their HOA sign, to a local billboard company. They installed a tall wooden frame right at the entrance, facing their main road. When the first ad went up, I almost laughed out loud. It wasn't rude or obscene, just a clean, bold banner that read, "This property is privately owned. Trespassers will be prosecuted." The HOA lost its mind. Linda called, furious, claiming I was defaming their community. I reminded her that the billboard was on my land and well within local regulations. She hung up mid-sentence, but I wasn't done. Over the next month, I quietly began improving my shoreline, planting new trees, repairing the dock, and installing solar lights that reflected beautifully across the water at night. The HOA hated it. They called it light pollution. The county called it perfectly legal. For every complaint they filed, I had a certificate, a permit, or a survey ready to prove them wrong. They tried to corner me with their rules, but my property wasn't their kingdom. And just when they thought they could still ignore me, I took the final step. With Harris's help, I drafted a formal cease and desist notice to the HOA, demanding removal of their landscaping and signage from my property within 30 days. If they failed to comply, I'd start charging monthly rent for the use of the land, retroactive for every year they'd occupied it. The total? Nearly $38,000. When the notice arrived, I heard from 3 neighbors that the HOA board meeting that night went until nearly midnight. Rick was seen pacing in the parking lot. Linda was shouting about unlawful claims. But none of that mattered. Every word on that notice was backed by law. They had tried to fine me for my lake. Now they were the ones who owed me money for their sign. That I didn't need revenge that hurt. I just wanted revenge that educated, and I was about to give them a masterclass. After the notice went out, the board flailed. They hired attorneys they called emergency meetings, and they painted a picture of a neighborhood under siege. But the truth was simpler than their panic. Their pride had been pricked, and pride is loud when it hurts. Within days, the HOA sent a demand letter of their own claiming that my easement claim was frivolous, and that they would countersue for emotional distress and defamation. I read it on the porch while the lake breathed below me, and the geese threaded the morning fog across the water. I felt none of the fury they expected. Instead, I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes from being absolutely certain you are right. The first public blow to their plan came not from me, but from the county assessor. The assessor visited the entrance, where their big stone sign stood half on my parcel, and his face went unreadable as he compared the GPS coordinates to the deed lines. He issued a formal notice demanding removal of all landscaping and signage that encroached on private property. The county had effectively sided with me in language too polite for what it actually was. The HOA called this an overreach, and their forum, filled with outraged posts about bureaucracy and local politics. That night a camera crew from the local paper pulled up, and I watched them frame the stone sign with my billboard in the background. They wanted quotes. I gave them one simple sentence: property rights matter more than pride. The article ran the next morning, and overnight the comment section filled with people who had their own HOA horror stories. My HOA revenge story became a neighborhood cautionary tale, and people started using the phrase suburban justice in the same breath as outrage. Linda Pierce made statements to the paper insisting the board had meant no harm and only wanted community access. The reporters asked pointed questions about why their volunteer projects had been carried out on land that did not belong to them. Why had Rick been filming me yard? Why had they posted photos of my shoreline on their Facebook page? The story pulled at a thread, and before long more threads unraveled. Meanwhile, Harris filed the paperwork to collect rent retroactively. For the years the HOA had occupied my strip, he kept his tone professional. He never used the sensational language the online crowd wanted. Instead, he sent crisp legal notices itemizing landscaping, labor, sign installation equipment, and the market value of the frontage for traffic exposure. The number was precise and cold, and it landed like a budgetary sucker. Punch board members started calling me privately, pleading for a softer resolution. Linda pleaded for mediation, and Rick tried to bargain to make everything go away. Quietly, I answered only once and told them the terms were straightforward: remove the sign, remove the landscaping issue, a public apology, and compensate for the years they had used my land. I reminded them I wanted no humiliation, only respect for law and property. They balked, and then they accepted, partly because their legal counsel ran the numbers, and partly because of the negative press and the slow drip of neighbor discontent. Their defense fund was not endless, and the optics of suing a single homeowner who had documented everything so thoroughly would have been terrible for their covenant community. They agreed to my terms and signed the mediated settlement. On the day they removed the stone sign and ripped out the hedges, a small crowd gathered across the road. People came with phones and cups of coffee to watch the unraveling of something that had seemed immovable. 2 volunteers from the HOA unloaded the stone onto a flatbed and drove it away. The big stone that had once said community with confidential letters bobbed in the rearview mirror like an apology. In transit, Rick avoided eye contact when he walked past my driveway, but Linda stood at the entrance and read a statement into her phone apologizing for the confusion and promising better governance. She posted the statement to their group, and the thread that had seethed for months softened to careful curiosity. The county recorded the removal. The billboard company rolled the frame up, and I took down the smaller private sign I had installed, not in triumph, but because the point had been made. A small check arrived weeks later from the HOA to cover the retroactive rent and landscaping expenses. It was not the $38,000 I had initially calculated, but it was more than a symbolic amount. It represented accountability and the price of overreach. A few neighbors who had watched silently for months stopped to talk and admitted they had been embarrassed by the way the board handled things. They told stories about petty fines and overzealous enforcement, and the sense of relief that came when the story had ended without a drawn-out legal war. The best part was quieter than any check or headline. I sat on the dock one evening with a coffee cooling in my hands and watched a family set up a picnic at the far end of the road across from my property. They weren't from the HOA. They were locals who had seen the paper and read what had happened. They smiled at me as they walked by, and that small nod felt like permission to breathe again. It turned out the revenge I'd planned was never about money or humiliation. It was about restoring balance and teaching a lesson in limits. I had given them every chance to correct course, and they had chosen instead to escalate until the law elevated the truth beyond argument. I did not gloat when they paid or when the forums quieted. Instead, I felt the gentle satisfaction of someone who had defended a line, not just on a map, but a line in principle. There were late nights afterwards, too. There are always echoes after a fight. Old friends checked in and offered beer, and old enemies became quieter. Some board member resigned, and new faces came in with promises to be better. The HOA adopted clearer policies about property boundaries and volunteer projects. They installed a community liaison who reached out to me at one point with an awkward but sincere invitation to talk about cooperation. I accepted, and we walked the edge of the water, talking about native plants and light pollution and the right distance between neighborly generosity and control. When winter came, the lake still froze in gentle sheets, and the same oak tree dropped its leaves into the water in a pattern I could predict and appreciate. I repaired the dock one last time, had the wood oiled and the lights calibrated so at night the surface would be a long band of soft glow. It was not revenge as spectacle, it was revenge as restoration. If there's a moral here, it is not that patience always wins, or that law is infallible. It is that steadiness and documentation and a refusal to be bullied shape outcomes more often than the loudest complaint. It is also that communities are fragile and that power without humility becomes petty and destructive. And so I close this with the one thing I wanted from the beginning: peace, not as a silence enforced by fear, but as a life resumed, as the dock settling under my feet, as the water answering the moon, as my dog finally sleeping through the night. Sometimes peace is the loudest revenge of all. If this story resonated and you believe in standing your ground for what is right, hit like and subscribe so we can keep telling stories where ordinary people find extraordinary ways to get their payback.